In this case, we are going to use .NET Core. The other one is using Node.js. So let's understand this training. So we have a few sessions during the day. So today, 8 a.m. Pacific, and then we are back at 10, and then 12 midday, and then 2 p.m. On each session, we are going to cover some of the topics of the training, showing you how to do it, and then give you some time to complete that step, and then we come back for Q&A and go to the next step. And at any point, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or use the Q&A panel on the webinar link, on the webinar interface. And the training today is essentially following what you can see on the online tutorial. So essentially what we have at learnforge.autodesk.io. And if you go to the view module section, that's what we are covering today. So the goal of this training is to create an application like this, where you can browse to this interface, create a new bucket. A bucket is essentially a folder where we can host our files, and then how to upload the file to this bucket, and how to then, once we upload the file like that, we can translate the file using the model derivative API, and in the end of the process, view that file. To create an application like that, we need, as I said, we're going to run through a few sections to create this kind of application. The first section is right now, 8 a.m., introduction and setup. And again, all times are US Pacific time, or Pacific time. And then 10 a.m., midday, and 2 p.m. Each session will have around 30 minutes, depending on the Q&A and questions that you have. No, we are going to record everything. You can watch the recordings later. We also have a clean recording available on our website if you want to just focus on the training. The recording for today may have a lot of Q&A and maybe a bit long, but essentially the same thing. Again, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button. Just raise your hand. I will go through the training and from time to time go to the Q&A panel and see if you have any questions. So don't wait until the end to ask your questions. Ask it as soon as you have questions. Okay, so let's start with the 8 a.m. session, introduction and setup. The first step we have to do today is to create a Forge account if we don't have one, and create a Forge application if we don't have one yet. And let me skip here. We have to install the tools we have to use today. Today we are going to use Visual Studio for Microsoft. That is a community edition that we can use for this training, and you can download and install from visualstudio.microsoft.com. When installing that tool, it's very important to select the ASP.NET Web Development and .NET Desktop Development. For this training today, we're not going to use the features on the .NET Desktop Development, but we will use those features Friday if you're attending the training at Friday as well. And overall, there is no big difference installing the second package, so I would recommend you to do it, to install that package. They call it workload when you are installing from Visual Studio. Okay, so let's take a look at how it works. And I should have, give me just a sec. Okay, so first step is to go to forge.autodesk.com, and if you don't have an account, create your account. Actually, you can create an account as you sign in to Forge. So you just come here, and if you don't have an account, create an account here. Once you click on it, you have to provide the information, and well, once you finish this step, you are going to receive a message from Autodesk on your email to confirm your email. So that's very important. Once you have your account, and the first time that you sign in with your account, and let me use my Gmail account, right? The first time you sign in, you will see something like this here, with the list of your applications. In my case, I have a lot of applications because I did this training before, and I keep testing. But on your case, this list will be empty, And what we have to do is to go to create an app and create our first app. When you click on create an app, you have to leave selected all the APIs. Well, that's easier. You don't have to select other ones. You can just leave them all selected and then go to the application name. So let me say Forge Training, and I'm calling day 1. We have to give it a description, and I'll just repeat day 1 of our training. And the one that is really important is the callback URL. So for today, it doesn't really matter a lot, but for tomorrow and for other code pieces of code that you may have, it may be very important. So it's important to type HTTP, and I'm going to give you the address for that, 3000/API/Forge callback off. So why are we using this callback? Because that's what we use on all of our samples. And how do you get this address? As I said, the training today is coming from the learnforge.autodesk.io. And the step that I'm following is actually right here before we start coding. And you see, create your Forge account, create an application, and here's the callback URL. So you can copy from here and come back and paste. So the callback URL is used when you do the three-legged authentication. And as I said, today, this is not important for the training today, but will be important for the training tomorrow. So it's important to have that exactly like that. And I can see that we have one question from Harry, and you raised your hand. Let me allow you to talk. Oh, you don't have questions. I think probably it's just the address, right? So as I said, come to learnforge.autodesk.io. We are on the before you start coding, and we are creating our account. And let me go back to create the application. And I have the name of the application, I have a description, I have a callback. So the callback is really important, and it must be exactly the same. Otherwise, the code will not work as expected. All right, so let's create our application. As soon as I hit create, I'm going also to receive an email from Autodesk confirming that my application was created. And what I need from this page is the client ID and client secret, right? It's very, very important to not share the client secret, because this is what your application, that's the password for your application, right? So today on this training, for instance, you're going to see what I'm typing here at some point, but I will delete or regenerate my client secret. So it's important to not share the client secret. This is the access to your information, right? So this is the password for your account. The client ID is somehow public, and you need to share that with some of your users depending on what they have, but it happens in a few cases. Okay, so that's what we need here. That's our Forge application. That's all we need on this step. Let me go back here to our, sorry. So that's the Forge application. The next step is to install, let me just get my mouse back. The next step is to install Visual Studio Microsoft. You see that I'm intentionally not typing the correct address. You just have to type and Google will help you find it, right? So Visual Studio, that's what we need for today. And if you come down to this page, you can see a few options: Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio for Mac. So what we want to install is the Visual Studio. That's the version we want. Visual Code, it works as well, but it's not as easy as Visual Studio. So we are going to use this first option. That's the one we have. If you download and install the Community 2019, just click to download and follow the steps to install it. Remember, we need to enable the workloads ASP.NET and .NET Desktop Development. It's very important to enable those two workloads for today. So any questions so far? Let me go back here. So what we just did is available on the Learn Forge tutorial. you can go to learnforge.autodesk.io, and we are completing the steps on home, which is the landing page, and before we start coding, and tools. The OAuth section, we didn't actually complement this step here because this is just instructions. So I would recommend you to also read what we have on the OAuth section. That's important for you to understand the next steps. So with that, I'll give you some time to make sure that you have installed Visual Studio and created your account and have your Forge application ready. For your Forge application, you should have the client ID and the client secret. This is really important. We need those two informations. You don't have to copy and paste somewhere. You just leave on that page, just like I did in here, right? I have my two pieces of information, client ID and client secret. If you double click, it will copy for you. So it's kind of easy. And let me go back. So home, before you start coding, tools. Make sure you complete those steps. And if you have any questions, I'll leave this webinar running, but we get back at 10 a.m. to confirm those steps and actually start coding. I'm giving you some extra time for this step because it may take some time to install Visual Studio, so go ahead and start it right away. And if you have any questions, just type on the Q&A section. And let me see, I think I have something here. Yeah, let me learnforge.autodesk.io. And as he asked for it, that's the callback. You should have all of that information there. Okay, I'll give you some time. Any other questions? So Harry is asking what time will the training resume? So it's 10 a.m. So 10 a.m. Pacific time, which should be in so right now is 8:15 a.m. So in 1 hour and 45 minutes we resume the training. It should give you plenty of time to install Visual Studio, create your Autodesk account, and create your Forge account, and make sure that you have all of that ready. Thank you, Harry, for your question. Any other questions? Any other comments? Anyone need me to repeat any of those steps? Moses is asking if this will be recorded. Yes, it is being recorded. You should have the answer live. Yeah, it is being recorded. Today's training will be a bit long for a recording. You may see that we will be like hours, right? And but we do have this training recorded in a clean version, which is only 20 minutes. It's really really fast. And as this is a recording, you can always pause and keep moving. So yes, it is recorded. We are going to make that available right after. Any other questions? Okay, so see you in a moment. I'll leave this webinar running. You don't have to close it. And if you close, you can just come back and resume. And see you at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which is 1 hour and 45 minutes from now. Okay, good morning again. Let's start with session 2. Hope everyone is back online. Just give you a few more seconds and we will resume. Let's see the chat window. Oh, hi Moses. Thank you. Okay, so let's do a quick recap to make sure that we have everything we need. So let's review our steps. So by now we should have the Forge account and application. You should have your client ID and secret, and you should also have the IDE installed and up and running. If you haven't run that yet, it's good to run it because sometimes it required for you to authorize or get a license, etc. So about the Forge application, you should have something like this, your application name here on the top and all the APIs selected. You should have your client ID and secret and the callback just like that. You should also have Visual Studio 2019 installed. You should be able to run it. And with that, any questions, preparing your account, preparing your Forge application, installing Visual Studio. Anyone has any questions that we can try to address? You can raise your hand, use the Q&A. If there is no questions, okay, I think you are good then. That's great news. So let's start with the first section then. Okay, moving forward. So what we'll do next is to create a new project using .NET Core. And for this class, we're going to choose .NET Core 3.1. And we are going to set up the environment variables, the startup.cs file, and the OAuth controller. That's where we actually use the ID and secret. Okay, let me switch here to my machine, and I have Visual Studio installed. So as I have this running for some time, when I open, I have a list of applications that I have, which is a bit different. You probably don't have anything or have a different list. You can select the type of application you want to run from this list, kind of option you want to run here. We want the create new project, but if you don't have this kind of UI, you can continue without code, and that should show you the full interface of Visual Studio, where we are going to go to File, New Project, and select the type of project we want. So in this case, I want the ASP Core Web Application. If you don't have that listed here, you can select C#, select the platform, all platform, and then cloud, and the ASP.NET Core Web Application should appear as the first option. We click next. So that's the name of our application. The name is important because we have some links on our application on the code. So it may be different depending on what you have. So that's why it's important to have that with the name that we use on the tutorial. So let me just grab that here. And that will be Forge sample, and you select a folder where you want to place your code and then hit create. So we are going to select .NET Core 3.1. we are going to select the empty option. There are a few other options. If you know or have something different, you can use in other options as well. And one thing that we don't want on our case is to configure HTTPS. It's just to simplify our process. We don't need that right here. So let me hit create, and it should take a moment. And if you have any questions or want to repeat those steps later, actually I'm not creating this here, right? So let me resize my window. We are on this, so we are following the viewer models tutorial. We went to create server section, and we selected .NET Core, and that's exactly what we did. Go to File New Project, select the language, select the platform, and select ASP.NET. Now we are going to the second step, which is the environment variables. So let me resize this slightly, and we are going to right click and go to properties, and here we have the go to debug, and we have the environment variables. Let me resize this a bit more so we have it better. All right, so we already have the ASP.NET Core environment variable here. We are going to add one more core URL, and that should be localhost 3000. You may ask why 3000. This is just something that is consistent on all of our samples. Just to make it easier, let me go back and grab our client ID and paste it in here. The next, the client secret. Let me also add, I'm copy and pasting that information. Let me go back here and paste. And the last is the callback URL. Let me add. As I said, it must match exactly the same. So what I have here, what I have on my code, and what I have on my application should match exactly the same. Otherwise I get an error message. So they all match. So I have the ASP.NET Core URL, force client ID, secret, and callback URL. I'm also going to rename this to 3000, just as I said, just for consistency, and that completes this step. So I have launch browser, I have all my environment variables, I have the app URL, and I have all the settings fixed here. Let me save this so I don't lose it. Now we are going to the startup.cs to make a few changes. This is just the way this sample is prepared to work, and if you have a different environment, you can of course adjust that. Let me open the startup.cs, and it says to add this namespace at the very beginning, and then go to the startup contents and replace with this content here. So what we are doing is the way the sample was designed is a bit different. It just says hello world. We want to have something different here. So let me get rid of this and replace with the one coming from our sample, from the tutorial. So what we're doing is to add the MVC support and setting that to version 3. Yeah, and I think I missed one step, right? I see that I have a complaint here about one missing reference, and that was on me. Let me go back to the beginning, and it says to add another package, right? And we also have to add the Autodesk Forge package. Sorry, I missed those two. Let's do it now. So right click on our project and then go to manage NuGet packages, and I'm going to browse and type Autodesk Forge, and that's the one I want, and let's install it, and okay. And the next one is to install the JSON package. Let's paste that here, and that's the one, and install. Okay, accept. Let me go back to my startup, and I see that now my error message is gone, which means because my package was just installed, so all good. Let me reduce this and go back here, and now we finished creating the classes, changing the code. The last step is to create a controllers folder inside the Web API application, because we're going to use that later. So let me right click and say add new folder, and we're calling it controllers. This is just, again, it's standard from Microsoft.NET to host all the controllers inside that folder. All right, so our next step is to see if I have any questions. Okay, all good so far. Excellent. So next step is to go to Authenticate. So as I remember before, it was important to read the section about OAuth to understand the difference between two-legged and three-legged. In this sample, we are doing the two-legged authentication, meaning the data belongs to the application. So that's why it's important, and it's important to have the secret protected. We're not going to access user data in this case, so we're not using three-legged in this sample application. Tomorrow we are going to use three-legged, not today. So let's do our two-legged implementation. Again, select .NET Core. So what it says here is to create inside the controllers folder to create a OAuth controller class. So let me copy this name and go to controllers and then right click and add new controller. So there is just a question here from Harry. He said he added the package but still getting that error message. Harry, please let me stop here for a moment and then go to manage NuGet packages, and if you go to install it, you can see the name. So make sure that that's the correct name, and the name here should match what we have on the documentation. And as you can see on my screen, I have version 3.1.9, so make sure to have that. That should fix it. If you are still unsure, you can open the CS project on the editor like this, and you can see the name, right? And if you are unsure, you can always just type the name here and rebuild. That should also work. So coming back to the create server step, go .NET, you see that the name here, it's matching exactly what I have in here. That's really important. Let me go back to Authenticate .NET Core, and as I was saying, we have to go to controllers, add controller. We're going to select API controller empty. We don't want to have anything like template code in there. And let's click add. It asks for the name. It's important to have the suffix controller. So that's a standard from Microsoft for .NET. And we're just changing the name, in our case, OAuth. C# is case sensitive, so it needs to be with this combination of upper and lower case. Let me add. Now we should have something like what is showing here. Give me a moment. Okay, now we have our OAuth controller, and as you can see, it matches the name here, controller base as well. But we don't need this skeleton, right? Because this is a different skeleton. We actually want the code that is coming from our tutorial. So let's copy and come back here, select all of it and replace. So what is our code doing? It's creating two tokens, one that we call internal and other one that we call public. The main difference between the public and internal is the level of how many scopes we have, right? So the public token is exposed to the outside, and it's used by the viewer later. And we don't want that token to have access to read additional information or even to write. We don't want that. So we have a special scope that is called viewables read, that is designed specifically for the viewer, and it just allows us to read the viewables on the viewer. The internal scope is broader and allows us to create, read, delete, and also to do that on buckets, and to read, write, and create and do some coding on the server side. So it's a much broader scope. But this is internal, so it should be fine. So this is the code to request a new access token once that's expired, and that's where we are getting the environment variables for this application. So we use the get environment variables right here to get the client ID and secret, and use that to get the access token. As you can see, the access token does not use the callback URL because this is two-legged, so that's why it's not used here. Okay. So there is a question from Harry. What's the namespace you have to add for Autodesk Forge namespace? So the reference is the Autodesk Forge reference. So if you go back to the Create a Server tab, go to .NET Core, you see that that's the name, Autodesk Forge, and the other one is the Newton Soft JSON. So with that, we are done with the OAuth authentication. Just one more thing, you see that when we do the internal or external, we are actually storing that information on our code using static variables, which means that every time a user comes to our application, they are all sharing the same access token, which is okay here, right? On the Autodesk perspective, we don't know your users, we just know your application. So what we do is to check if the token we have is still valid and use that. If not, we get a new one. So that this is just a minor optimization. We don't want to generate an access token on every request because it lags a small delay. So we are trying to prevent that on every request. So we have this check if the expiration is still valid and then move to the next step. All right, that's all of it for this step. Any questions, any concerns? Let me go back to the... Oops. So we completed the live demo. So what we're doing now is to create a server and do the authentication step. If you have any questions, you can post your questions here. I'll still be here for a few more minutes. Otherwise, we see each other in again in 1 hour and roughly 45 minutes. Midday Pacific time to complete the next steps. So I saw that I have Harry. Do you raise your hand? Let me allow you to talk. Go ahead. You should be able to talk now. Oh, you are all set. Okay, let me move you back to disabled talking. All right. Thank you, Harry. All good then. Any other questions with this step? You can raise your hand, use the Q&A, or use the chat window. Okay, so we will see each other again 12 noon midday Pacific in 1 hour and 40 something minutes. So complete the next step and try to complete those steps now. And if you have any questions, we can review that at the beginning of the next step. If you have any questions during the process, you can always type your question here, and as soon as we get back, we review your questions. There is one question on the Q&A. Let me see if I can, yeah. Look at the Q&A. So Forge is not accepting the callback URL format. That's a question from Zandi. It's not accepting the format. So Sandy, it's probably because here you mean when you click edit or create, which is essentially the same UI, it's not allowing you to type here, right? Probably there is some sort of mistake. For instance, if I type, no, by mistake I type a 1 here and try to move, it shouldn't, right? But because now it's invalid, right? It's just because the pattern is invalid. So make sure that you are not typing anything wrong. And if you are unsure, just go to the tutorial and go to the before you start coding, and you should have the precise URL here, and you can copy and paste to avoid any typos or small mistakes. So make sure that it is properly right. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? So yeah, you said that you did copy and paste but still not accepting. All right, so let's do this. Let me promote you to panelist so you can see. Can you? I can promote you to panelist, and you can share a screen and we can take a look. Is that okay? Let me do this. So I see you twice. Which one is you? Can you raise your hand on the participants panel? Okay, so let me move it to panelist and let me stop my share. Now you can share your screen. Let me move you back to any other question, Andy? Just let me move you back to panelist. Sorry, to attendee. Okay, any other questions? All right, so see you 12 noon midday Pacific for the next section. Please make sure to complete those steps, and if you have any questions, type those questions on the Q&A and we will get to those questions as soon as we get back. Thank you. So let's start, let's start with the noon section, which is about upload and translate. On this section of the training, we're going to see how to get the code for upload and translate our models. So by this point, you should have your project ready in Visual Studio, and you should also have the OAuth code on that OAuth controller class. Before we move forward, we had a few questions during the break, very specific, so I answered them on the Slack channel, on the Q&A channel. If you have any other questions, you can raise your hand. There is an option to raise your hand on the Zoom, and if you have, just raise it and we go back to it. Don't wait for your questions, just post them or raise your hand. So to upload and translate, we have two pieces on our code, the OSS controller and the mod derivative controller. The OSS controller is about creating buckets and uploading files to those buckets. You can see buckets as folders where we place our files. And the objects are the files that we host on our system. The mod derivative translates those files and get them ready for viewing. The translation process, you have to trigger that process explicitly, and that's why we have the mod derivative, and we also have the mod derivative to extract metadata from those models. On your application, you may decide to upload and translate as one step, but on this tutorial, we are uploading and translating them one step at a time, so you understand how it goes. Sorry. Moving forward, let's see a live demo of that section. Come back here. So we just finished the authentication. let's move to the finish here, and let's move to upload file to OSS. When we upload files, we have to select the retention policy for that file. It can be transient, temporary, or persistent. On this sample, we use transient as the retention policy, which means that after 24 hours, we delete those files from the buckets. This is very good for temporary storage, or something that is, just upload and extract information. Temporary is for 30 days, so the files will be deleted after 30 days. Last, the persistent approach. The files will only be deleted after you explicitly tell us to delete them. And all the buckets should be named with lowercase and numbers, and up to 128 characters. So let's select .NET Core, and that's our code to upload and create buckets and upload files. Just one important thing to notice here on the code is that when we create a bucket, and let's move all the way down to create buckets, you see that we prefix the bucket name with our client ID just to avoid naming conflicts. What happens is that every time, every bucket should be unique across all the accounts. So one way to ensure that the bucket names are unique is to prefix them with your client ID. And that's what we do on our sample. We transparently add the client ID dash, and when listing the buckets right in here, we remove that from the bucket name. So you don't see that every time, right? Because it becomes redundant. All right, so let's go to the beginning of the code, and it says to create an OSS controller and then add this code to it. So let's go back to our Visual Studio and right click on the controllers folder and say add new controller. Again, API empty controller, and click add, and we are calling OSS controller and click add. Okay, so now we copy the code from here and paste. So that's the code we have for create bucket and upload files. Let's save it and move to the next step. Next step is about translate files. There is just a small note saying that in this case we upload files to the system using the write enabled bucket access token, and that's important to avoid to have a write only and internal only token to avoid someone else being able to access and write to your buckets. Next is about translating the files. The translation process is about getting the original file and preparing that for viewing. In that process, we extract the geometry and the metadata, this data, and we also extract the thumbnails of every file that we translate. And that's the actual process of preparing for viewing. Let's again select .NET Core. And this code contains basically just one method, which is a post jobs that will translate for 2D and 3D. That's what we want here. So let's copy this and create the model derivative controller. Go back to our code on Visual Studio and right click, add new controller. Again, API controller, and hit add model derivative controller and hit add. And let's paste in here, and all right, that's our code, and let's save it. And with that, we complete this step. So the translation process will always run for 2D and 3D in this case, and that's mostly it. If you have different types of inputs, let's say you have a zip file or you have a file using references, then we have to change this code to adjust to this step, right? In this case, we are considering just one independent file that is named with an extension that indicates the file, right? So it's not a zip. This sample does not support a zip and does not support linked files. but mod derivative supports that. So we just have to change the code if we want to support all of those features. So let me see if you have any questions. And let's see, let me go back here. That was the live demo, and we just completed the upload file to OSS and translate files. I'll leave this running as before, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. to complete the last step of the tutorial. And as before, you can post your questions on the Q&A, or raise your hand, or use the chat window to ask questions. I hope everyone's still there. Can see all the names at least. Any questions? All right, so there is a question from Zandi. Is there a limitation for the translation? I don't know what you mean. I can open your microphone and if you wanna ask your question, would that help? If so, Zandi, can you just raise your hand and I can open your microphone? If I go back to the Forge API, Forge website, and I go to forge.autodesk.com, I can see all the supported files from mod derivative. And if that's what you are referring to, limitations, right? If you go to the developer's guide, you can see the supported translations. So those are all the file formats that are supported, and they will all work for the translation to SVF, which is the file that we see on the viewer. But it works really well for all of those files. So she's saying that not able to speak, but my question pertains to limitations of model uploads to buckets. So there is no limitation if in all of those supported files, right? So if the file is listed here, it should work regardless. As I said, the only limitation on the sample is that the sample is very simple and we only handle one file at a time. But you can upload multiple files, you can upload zip files inclusive, right? But other than this is just on the sample, not on the API itself. We have there is a advanced version of that sample, and let me open that here. So all of our samples are on GitHub, by the way. So let me go to the Autodesk and then get the view models. Not here, sorry, here. View models, and where is it? Here, Forge view models. So this sample is essentially the same code we are doing today, but with additional features like zip files. So you can try this one if you want, which is a more advanced version. There is a question from David as well. Is there a way to know how long the translation will take? I assume the larger file, the longer will take. Actually, there is no way to anticipate how long the file will take. You can see the progress, but it's not about the size of the file, but it's also about how complex the geometry is. So it may be a very small file with a very complex geometry that may take a lot of time. So it varies a lot. But if you have a similar file size and complexity, it should always be the same. It should be very consistent at least, but it varies. And David, if you are looking for a better support on that, you can look at the documentation and go to the webhooks API. So the webhooks API should call you back when the translation is ready, or should also call you back once the translation keeps moving, right? So if you look at the supported events mod derivative, there is an extraction updated. So every time it increases the percentage, let's say from 10 to 20%, it will give you a call saying, okay, 20% now. So that's a way for you to see how long it's taking. But it's possible that a translation will go all the way to, I don't know, 80%, and then take a very long time to get to 90%. It really depends on how complex the geometry is, and if the code is hitting all of those pieces of complex geometry. Yeah, thank you both for your questions. So I'll give you a few more minutes for additional questions, but we'll be back again 2 p.m. for the last piece and for additional questions. And if you're feeling comfortable, you can also start doing the next section and just come back for questions later. But we are going to do it live later. Okay, so let me pause and all right, so let's start with this 2 p.m. show on viewer piece of the tutorial. Let's review what we have at this point. By this point, we should have the upload code and translate code running or ready. If you have any questions, you can post that on the Q&A, or we're going to answer them in a few moments. So the next step, that's actually when we actually create a viewer, and we have to do 3 big groups of files with 4 files for this section: the main HTML file, the CSS, the JavaScript with 2 pieces on the JavaScript. So let's do it. This piece live demo. Let me move here, and let's move to show on viewer and select .NET Core. So depending on the language we have, in this case .NET Core, we have different ways of structuring the static files. So in this case, let's go to solutions inside the root of our application and create a new folder that must be named www root. You see that when I hit enter, that it will have a different icon, because that's how the .NET Core will understand the client side, the static files from our application. So inside here, let's create 2 subfolders, CSS and JS. So the purpose is to host those files, and so we can keep them organized. It's just standard. And let's move to the next step. So here we're going to create the index.html. Right now we are on version 7. You may have a version 6 compatible application. In that case, you want to use v6, but if you don't have anything, go to v7. Let's copy this, and it says to create the index.html at the root of our www root folder. So add new item, and that will be an HTML page that we are going to call it index. So it comes with standard content. Let's get rid of this, delete, and paste our new content. So that's our HTML file. Let's save this. Moving forward, the next step is to create the main CSS. The CSS defines how the actual interface will behave. So like how where to list the buckets, where to list the viewer, and how to organize the web page. So let's copy this and go back to CSS, add new item, and that will be cascade. What's this scrolling? web content style sheet. That will be our main, and add, again, comes with a default body. Let's place our content. Last, let's create the, inside the JS file, create the forestry.js. Add a new item. Content, in this case, will be script, JavaScript, and click on forestry. So in most cases, HTML is not case sensitive, but depending on where you host, it may be. So let's keep it using the what we have here, so it's consistent. Let's say if you host that on Heroku, Heroku can be case sensitive. So that's the forestry that will list all the buckets we have and all the files we have inside those buckets. It's not actually a Forge component, but we are listing using that to list Forge buckets and objects. This will also handle the upload from the client side. Last, that's the piece that is actually running the viewer. Let me spend a few minutes here. So we have a function that is called launch viewer that gets the access token and the URN to view the file. The URN is the unique identifier for that file that is hosted on Autodesk. And here is a create a viewer on a div that we have on our code, and start that viewer, and then load the document with the URN that we're passing as a parameter here. Once the document is loaded, we are going to get the default geometry and load that geometry inside the viewer. What do we mean by geometry? So let's say we have a Revit file. A Revit file may contain multiple 3D views and multiple 2D views. So the default for a Revit file is the 3D, the 3D view named round brackets 3D. For AutoCAD file, that's the 2D view. And it goes, right? Depending on the file that you have different default views on that file. And we have a few additional handling here, but not that relevant. But in many cases, I want to take some action as soon as the document is loaded. So let's say after the document's loaded, I want to start reading some geometry, start doing something with that file. So that's why this load document is important. And this event here is telling me that the load is complete. So okay, let's copy this, go back to our project, file, add new item, JavaScript, and Forge viewer, and paste in here. Okay, so now that we have all of the sections done, the last step is to run our application. Let me move to run. And well, depending on the type of file that the type of application you have, you may not have a sample file that to test it. So here are a few sample files that you can use. You can download them here. And to run the application in .NET Core, it's quite straightforward. You just go to the play button, select the browser you want to run, and press run. As you see, I already have the IIS Express, which is it's just a configuration to run my application, and I can select a different browser if I want. Yeah, sorry, the image is not up to date. They keep changing that on every version, so that's why it's slightly outdated. But you can just hit play, and that should do the trick. So if I hit play, and it's building, when it's done, by default, in most cases, it will launch the browser. So you just have to wait. You see that I have my browser running, localhost 3000, and assuming we did everything right, we should see something like this. The fact that it's loading here, now it's not loading anymore. It means that it's all good, right? I don't have any buckets on my application, and the loading went through, and I can see there is no buckets at this point. So my first step is to create a new bucket. And as I mentioned, the bucket should be lowercase, no spaces, and lowercase and numbers. So let's say my first bucket, and create my bucket. The bucket should appear here. And if I expand, I don't have any files inside my bucket. But if I right click and upload the file, I can select one of the many files that I have on my computer, if you have any files. And let me see, that's a typical sample from Revit. Let's open. And this is going through my internet connection. So it's going from my computer to Forge. So depending on how fast is your connection locally, it may take some time to upload. But when you have that run on a server, that should be faster. But still, that's the time that takes from your computer to your server. So now I have my file. If I click here, it's going to say that the file is not translated. Of course, I just uploaded that file, and I can say start translation. So translation is started. Please try again in a moment. So this is a very, very basic sample. It doesn't auto update the information. So that's why we have to click again and see if the translation is done. So we can see that the translation is 0% complete. It means that it's starting. I just have to wait and try again in a moment. Let's try again. Yeah, it's still running. Depending on how busy the Autodesk Forge servers are at that moment, it may take a few seconds to start or may take more time. But we are always launching more servers to process the files depending on how busy we are. So now it's 13%. And there was a question on how long it takes to translate a file. There's no way to predict that, well, if you don't have the same file, right? Because the translation time varies from how complex the file is and how big the file is. So it varies a lot. So there is no really way to anticipate that. But if your files are very similar in size and complexity, you can estimate based on previous values. So let's click again, 97%. Okay, now we have our file loading, and that's the viewer. Everything is here. If I upload more files, they will show here and I can translate them. I have all the features that I would expect. And as this is a Revit file, I can click on this extension here, Document Browser, and see that as I requested, I have my 3D view and all my 2D views from that file. And I can even navigate between the 2D views. So with that, we complete this piece, which is showing viewer. I will leave the Q&A running for some time so you can try this step and ask questions. But essentially that's the step we just did. And this consists in creating the index and the main CSS and the Forge view and Forge 3.js. If you have any questions, you can post those questions on the Q&A. As I said, I will leave it running for some time. And if you have additional questions or additional APIs that you want to play, we have the another training coming tomorrow. And tomorrow is about bringing those models from BIM 360 or Fusion Team. And Wednesday, it's about extending and customizing the viewer. Thursday, we're going to do some dashboards. And Friday, how to modify models. So those are the trainings we have this week. If you have registered for one of the other trainings, you are going to receive the emails for each of the trainings. You just have to wait for it. It's coming. And let's see. I think I have a question here. Question. In BIM 360, we're limited to publish once a week. Can we do it? Can we do more with our own viewer? So Moses, I don't know what you mean by limited to publish. Maybe it's a process. I'm not aware of limitations. I'm not aware of a limitation how many times you can publish, right? If you have a different constraint on your BIM 360 account, as you're talking about BIM 360, that's on BIM 360. The API, it's not doing different from what you have on the product. The API is just accessing the product. So whatever limitations or contract limitations you have on your BIM 360 account, the same will apply here. So yeah, the API is just using the same interface. And just before I give you some time, if you have any other questions, even after here, you can post your questions on Stack Overflow using the Autodesk Forge, Autodesk Viewer, or Autodesk Model Derivative tags, and we answer all the questions on Stack Overflow. So go ahead and post your questions there if you have anything after here. But let me go back to the Q&A. So he says, Moses, about the how many times you post. It means that the viewer model matched the Revit model. So let me answer live. So yes, so tomorrow we are going to talk about how to connect to BIM 360, and using the API from Forge, you can access the exact same model from BIM 360. So it's essentially the same viewer. The big difference is that when we do a customization and have our custom viewer, like in here, we don't have all the viewer features you have inside BIM 360. So to give a very concrete example, right? So we have some of the compare versions features on BIM 360. We don't have that as something to use on the viewer outside. This is a BIM 360 product feature, right? So it varies. So I hope I'm on the right direction here. And if you wanna open your microphone, I can allow you. So just raise your hand, Moses, so I can open your microphone if you want. So I'll leave you with the next trainings. So tomorrow and the rest of the week, we have some additional trainings. And we are now completing the show on viewer section of the tutorial. Any other questions? Okay, so I'll leave this running for some time. And yeah, let me leave on the questions piece. And pause here. So there is one more question. Zandi, will you update deployment in the next sections? Oh, if we will include deployment in the next sections. Actually, the deployment piece is quite direct, but let me, I think I know what you mean, right? So if I go back to the tutorial, and sorry, it's right here. Let me summarize this. There is a deployment option right here. So deployment is really unique. So it varies a lot on what kind of location you want to deploy your application. So it varies a lot. So if you don't have any concerns or you don't have any requirements, sorry, on where to deploy your application, the easiest way to deploy is Heroku. By far, that's the easiest, right? And it works with Node.js and .NET Core. So if you don't have any other requirements, I would suggest go here. And the steps are quite straightforward. You just have to upload your code and set up the environment variables just like we did here. And if you do something like this, the application will run on Heroku very, very direct. So that will be my suggestion. But I'm not planning to, we don't have a one day specifically to cover this. But .NET Core on Heroku, that's the easiest way. Any other questions? So Ugo is asking about the link to the recordings. Yes, we are going to share that. But if you want to watch the short version, Forge training recap, there is a, if you look, and I'm going to share that on the chat window right now. This is from our, we did this training back in April, and you can find the summary from April here in the recording. So this recording from April, it's the same thing we did today. So this is today, and this is tomorrow. The only difference is that it's a clean recording, right? Without all the Q&A, and it's very fast and it's very small. And if you hit play, you see that it's just 20 minutes. So it's really short. And as this is a recording, you can just play and pause as much as you want and focus on the part that you need the most, right? So yeah, that would be my suggestion. Instead of getting the recording from today, which is quite long, get this one, which 20 minutes, really focus on what we have to do. Hope that helps better, Hugo. All right, any other questions? Okay, thank you. And if you're attending tomorrow, see you tomorrow. I will stop sharing and stop my recording.